This video is about direct observations of practice using the York model on the apprenticeship social work programs. So the agenda is roughly to outline the requirements for direct observations and talk a little bit about the observation process, including the planning for observations, and a little bit about feedback and some suggestions of ways in which you might do that. So who does what when? Well, the apprentices have to complete at least 3 direct observations over the whole course, regardless of the route on which they are on. So for either BA or PG DIB routes, 3 observations. The first will always be completed during the contrasting learning experience, or CLE, and the second and third will be completed on the final practice learning experience, or FPLE. The mentor or the on-site supervisor will complete the CLE direct observations. That's the first one. And usually the first DO on the FPLE is done by the SRA and the second by the mentor or OSS. Now, there may be some negotiable kind of changes to who does what, but usually the principle is that this will be an experienced social worker, and sometimes the order of who does what might change, but this is generally how things are supposed to work. We use the York model, very well known in social work education. It's been used for quite a long time. That's by Koprowska et al. It's been around for a little while. And yes, of course, there is a template, contents, and we will go through them. It's a simple intro and then 5 sections that need to be completed. And there's a FPLE feedback form to be gathered. So that will usually be designed by the apprentice. There are lots of templates available on the module, online, in other places. Perhaps something is used in that particular agency, but there's a huge diversity of practice for the apprentices, different work contexts, and so on and so forth. So usually it's best if the apprentice does something that is specific to their work. Template looks a little bit like that. There are kind of slightly different versions of it available, but it'll be more or less like this. The sections will generally be the same. So the stages in planning and preparation. You start off with planning, then you negotiate the goals, observing. What do you do then? And of course, there's feedback process at the end. I mean, you can read the slide. Now we'll just go through and give a little bit more detail on each section. So planning, goals for the observation should be negotiated and discussed. The observer will ask the apprentice to not only identify their goals, but to formulate these in concrete and specific terms. So say exactly what you want to be observed, as it were. And the apprentice, as a way of focusing on concrete goals, is asked to say how they will know they have achieved those goals. Obviously, the goals should be written and referred to in the feedback session that comes towards the end of the process. And then the apprentice is in position to complete the observation details in the intro section, and then spend a bit of time on section 1 of the template. Remember to maintain confidentiality throughout. Don't put in any PLE names or family names or other identifiers, that might identify a PLE or somebody connected to them. So the kind of thing you might write in section 1, give a little bit of background. Why are you involved? Was the agency involved? Was there an original reason for the referral that you know about? And what is the purpose of this particular session? What do you hope to achieve? I'm going to say this a few times, but how was consent obtained? We are quite often going into people's homes, and of course we need to respect that, as I'm sure you all know. So we ask for consent and confirm that on multiple occasions. Well, once is usually not enough. Are there intersectional elements, this particular scenario that you're going into, that need to be taken into account? And if so, what difference might that make for your planning? other arrangements, such as straightforward things like the venue, how long you might devote to this particular observations. Are other people going to be there, family members, for example, or other involved parties? Have you considered practice models, theory, legislation that is relevant for the direct observation, things that you hope to use or are actually informing the practice in some other ways? And are there things you would particularly like feedback on? And quite helpful sometimes to express those in terms of specific PCF domains. So obviously before the observation, the apprentice makes the arrangements. And again, note how permission was gained in that first section. The majority of observations will be of work with PLE, but there are occasions when other options might be allowed by negotiation. So, for example, if it's not all that easy for the apprentice to actually be observed, and some practice settings are like that, or they need evidence for a particular domain, so not untypically perhaps PCF 9, and they might want to kind of do a presentation or some training exercise to a team. So some options, yes, but only once during the 3 observations. So the other 2, at a minimum, have to be of work with PLE. It's worth considering if there are any circumstances in which the observer may intervene. Doesn't happen very often. We'll come back to that. But do have a brief chat, if nothing else, about that. And make sure you have agreed the arrangements for the observer seeking immediate feedback from the PLE. During the observation, check that PLE consent again. Think about the physical environment, about seating. Try not to be in each other's eye line. It can be quite distracting. And if there are any other physical environment things that you need to consider. As I said, online is acceptable, but only for one of the 3 required observations. And if you are doing online, and we have done several of these, and they tend to work fine, but if you are doing that, plan it carefully and definitely check your tech. There's nothing more irritating than people kind of trying to get the recording and trying to kind of make connection over Teams or whatever it happens to be. So check the tech early on. During the observation, I mean, the observer should, of course, keep the goals in mind, but social work being social work, you often have unanticipated events. So make headspace for that, if you will. You should take detailed notes. Sometimes people take audio, video recordings, but other sorts of recordings of that nature. But that absolutely must be with the consent and the specific consent of the person with lived experience, and be very careful about data confidentiality. So it's not only getting permission for that actual recording, but it's for what you do with that afterwards. Make sure that it is deleted in whatever format you collected in. Observers, this very rarely happens, but should only really intervene if failure to do so is going to lead to immediate physical or psychological harm or injury to the apprentice or PLE. Now, I'm not going to give examples. It is actually very rare in my experience, but it does happen sometimes. In the main, really the observer observes, sits back. When the session has been completed, and it is appropriate and possible to do so, because that isn't always the case, spend a few minutes with the PLE to gain some feedback using the form the apprentice has provided. And if that's not working for any reason, there should be at least a verbal conversation about what has happened. On occasion, PLE might be simply too tired to give feedback, or may have been upset by the interview and not want to talk to you anymore. And if that is the case, then you leave well enough alone. They come back to it on another day, and sometimes it just won't be possible. We'll have a little look at what you do in those circumstances later on in the presentation. So after the observation, the observer really should have a quick chat with the apprentice, because it's probably been the case that the apprentice is maybe outside the house or outside the door in the corridor waiting for the observer to come back and tell them about what the PLE said. So don't leave them hanging. Basically, do have a little chat with them and give your initial impressions. It doesn't have to be in great detail. Um, Apprentice completes as soon as possible afterwards section 2. Their reflections on the direct observation. Be careful about adding too much detail. You do not have to describe every single interaction. Try to keep it to the most important things, and there is an opportunity later on to reflect in more detail. In any event, it's the observer who should be providing the bulk of the feedback. Once the apprentice has finished section 2, we send that to the mentor. So the mentor then is in position to consult their notes and write up the mentor feedback or section 3. So once they've done that, they should send to the apprentice before they meet up again. There should be an opportunity to talk about what happened, and perhaps people's reflections change a little bit over time and so on. And certainly, two people watching the same situation can come away with very different impressions. There are two sections, a brief overall summary on the part of the observer, and then the individual PCFs 1 to 9. I would suggest that do keep the summary brief and put more detail in the individual PCF domains, because they tend to be more specific and more useful as feedback and learning opportunities for the apprentice. When you meet again afterwards, it's good for the apprentice to evaluate their own performance and perhaps link to the goals that they already set out for the observation in section 1. And really, you should go through the goals one by one. The apprentice might add different information, their impression. They may have changed course in the middle of interview. They may have done all sorts of different things. Social work is not straightforward. Stuff happens, does it not? So it's worth having a more detailed and in-depth conversation about those things. There are many models for feedback, and I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the surprises, learnings, satisfactions, and dissatisfactions, and that might help, but really you could use whatever you feel is appropriate, perhaps whatever you're used to. As soon as practical, the observer may want to update their feedback and in some more detail, and send that back to the apprentice so they can complete their reflection in section 4. And this is where the learning happens, really. It's the apprentice's reflections. After all, they've been through FPLE, they've been through planning, they identified goals, the actual observation happened, then there was PLE feedback, and now the apprentice has an opportunity to put that together in some way, shape, or form, say what they were thinking and feeling about that. Completing a short action plan, or at least starting it at that stage, is a good idea. But of course, the observer should be involved in doing that also. Some general guidelines for giving effective feedback. This BOOST acronym is probably going to be familiar to a lot of people, but always include positive and developmental feedback. And usually start with the positive, the good things that you saw before you get to the developmental feedback. That's usually the way things go. Sometimes if things have been really gone disastrously wrong, it might be better just to get to the point. People argue about this, but nonetheless, try to start with the positives if you can. Feedback on what was observed, not your bias or your impression of the person's personality or character. That's not what's at issue. And definitely talk about what you saw. Not what about other people thought about the apprentice, but what you can evidence that you saw. Be specific. Kind of general feedback you could communicate better isn't really going to do very much, is it? But if you say something like, the young person really felt a bit uncomfortable when you were standing over them and it was like you were lecturing them, perhaps you could sit down. Or the older person that you were talking to, you kind of mumbled a bit, and maybe you could have been a bit more clear in your diction, whatever it might be. But try to be specific in your feedback, because if we're specific, then a person can do something about it. And do be prompt. There's two kind of reasons for that. One is that the longer you leave it, the less likely you are to recollect accurately what went on. But also, there is some anxiety in these form of assessments, and it does contribute to the overall assessment of the apprentice. So therefore, don't kind of let that anxiety fester. Let's try to kind of move these things along fairly rapidly. So, as I said, this is assessment of practice, one of the more powerful forms of assessment of practice. And then perhaps spend a little time thinking about how do you build on the strengths identified? How could you do more of the good stuff? It doesn't always have to be about what we need to do differently. Uh, if there are areas for development that are identified, what are you going to do about that? What methods would help to kind of move things on a little bit? Would you use role play, simulation, other teaching methods? Try again to be as concrete as possible as you can about those things. So this is general consideration that you need to plan for and think about the use of power in these situations. The power to, the power over, the power with, from Thompson's model. Think carefully about PLE involvement and spend time discussing this with the apprentice. It sounds obvious, and perhaps it is, but that's no reason not to say it. Things don't always go off as planned, as I said earlier. It is social work after all. So there are times when the session will not gather enough evidence of capable practice. It can be very simple things that the PLE is asleep. Maybe the apprentice does not perform well on this day. Maybe they have something that kind of went askew for them at the start of the day, and they find it very difficult to concentrate or focus on what they're doing. There could be any number of reasons. But if you haven't collected evidence of capable practice, then a new observation will have to be arranged because that's a requirement in the portfolio. There has to be observations of capable practice. So it's not just you finish the observation and done. Sometimes, as I said earlier, again, it's not possible to get PLE feedback. They may be upset or tired or just sick of the sight of you by this stage, and they don't want to do it there and then. Some people will come back and do it later on. Perhaps you give them the form or send it to them by email, or you have a phone call or whatever arrangement is suitable, generally led by the PLE rather than what we need. But sometimes it just doesn't happen. It's not possible. So for the purposes of the portfolio, that will mean that the apprentice is going to have to get feedback from another PLE. Doesn't have to be connected to the observation in any way, shape, or form, but they must have the required number of PLE feedbacks depending on the year. That's basically, if they're on the CLE, it's going to be 1, and if they're in the final year, the FPLE, they'll need 2. Just something to bear in mind. It's usually not a big problem. Is that all there is? Well, no, of course not. We're very used to the York model in social work, but there are other approaches. There's a nice little review of the evidence about observation and practice in the research and practice review. That's available to students, and we can make that available to observers, mentors, on-site supervisors, or whoever. And again, a more detailed look from Christine Edmonds again online. So these are open access resources and you might find them useful or viable. We would ask you to please stick to the York model as the process because it works very well. But how you feedback and things of that nature, very much up to you. And I think that's all we have for today on direct observations. So I thank you very much for your time and I wish you good luck with whatever observations you were undertaking. So thank you very much and goodbye.